I'm going to segue us into our next session, which features a conversation on political dimensions of disinformation and misinformation. Dr. David Danks will facilitate this conversation. He is the Louis Leon Thurston Professor of Philosophy and Psychology, the head of the Department of Philosophy, and the founding co-director of the Center for Informed Democracy and Cybersecurity at Carnegie Mellon University. He is an affiliate member of the Carnegie Mellon Neuroscience Institute and the Heinz College of Information Systems and Public Policy. He is also the chief ethicist for the Block Center for Technology and Society. That's a title I envy, chief ethicist. Dr. Danks has published dozens of articles in peer-reviewed journals and is the author of the book, Unifying the Mind, Cognitive Representations as Graphic Models. He is the co-principal investigator with our first speaker, Dr. Kathleen Carley, for nearly $6 million in grants, and co-principal investigator of several additional concurrent grants. We are so proud to partner with him. He will facilitate a conversation with Dr. Michael Colorisi. Dr. Colorisi is the William S. Dietrich II Chair of Political Science at the University of Pittsburgh, where he is also the Research and Academic Director of the Institute for Cyber Law, Policy, and Security, as well as a faculty affiliate in the Intelligent Systems program. Dr. Colorisi is the author of many articles and 3 books, including Democracy Declassified: The Secrecy Dilemma in National Security. He is an award-winning scholar whose work has been supported by the National Science Foundation. We're so delighted to partner with him. Gentlemen, we look forward to your conversation.
Thanks so much for those generous introductions, Darlene, and thanks, Mike, for joining me for this conversation. It's great to see you, even if it's virtually rather than in person.
You too, David. I just want to also echo my thanks, and also thank Kathleen for getting us started. That was a great talk with a lot to follow up on.
Absolutely, and it certainly sets the stage for the conversation nicely. I mean, I'd like to start with something that I think came through pretty clearly in the 3rd slide of Kathleen's talk, which is the fact that in many ways disinformation and misinformation, at least in one way of thinking about it, isn't new. I mean, there's always been propaganda, there's always been spin, to use the more modern political term for it. We've always had people who attempted to distort messages and even lie in messages to gain some outcome that they really wanted. So from your perspective, thinking about this as a political scientist, as somebody embedded in thinking about the political dimensions, what do you see as being different about the state we're in now? I mean, why aren't we in the same place we've been for 200 years of the proper response to bad speech is more speech kinds of ideas that have typically informed our political debates about this?
Sure. So I should say I'm on one side of this in political science, where there'd be plenty of people that would be sitting here and telling you, it's okay, don't worry so much. It is just like it's been. I'm not one of those people because my research has led me not to be. And so I think there's really 3 things to think about of what's truly different. But it is important to focus on some of the consistency and learn from the past. So active measures in Cold War, right, disinformation, propaganda, counterfeit campaigns are now famous in movies and in newspaper articles. And so we know that has been going on. Some of those campaigns, for example, blaming the US for AIDS or other biological agents, look a lot like disinformation now on COVID. And so there's these absolute echoes of the past that seem very, very consistent. And it's important, I think, to focus on because there are some real consistencies there, particularly when we're talking about intentions and disruption, which I think is an important part of the story that we should talk about, what Kathleen called these polarization campaigns. So 3 things I think are different. So one is obviously information communication technology is just different. right now. That our brains, you can think about what screens do is sort of open up our brains to messages from places that it used to be very, very difficult to get in millions of people's heads, right? A given message. That was nearly impossible, and active measures would have loved to have had that, like during the Cold War. And now that's possible. At first, we thought that was a great thing. So the idea of liberation tech and connecting the world and everyone in a heterogeneity of voices sort of ringing out, and that excitement is real, and we do see more heterogeneity in messages and signals and beliefs out there. And that is not all a bad thing, but we do have to realize the flip side, the dark side of that, which is the vulnerability to messages, the influenceability of people. That interacts with the second piece that we absolutely don't talk enough about, which is crucial to this. And this is a term known as data valence. I mean, some people call this surveillance capitalism. But one thing is new is the cookie crumbs that we leave on our computer and servers that are hints to who we are. And one thing that's different is we can think about a sort of material political age for democracies of the Cold War and before, and we're in very much a digital computational information age, and the rules are different. The physics at the speed of light is just different. And one of the things we do is we absolutely leave pieces of who we are around that can be used to target us. And so it's not just that our brains are potentially opened in these screens to information, but we also leave hints of how to manipulate us, what our tribes are, what our prejudices are that make us even more manipulable. And that wasn't around before. That was very difficult to accomplish. And so if the analogy used to be dropping pamphlets from a plane in the material age for propaganda, right now it's literally serving you an individualized ad that only you or someone like you with your browser history, right, is seeing and other people don't see. And the last piece that brings these together is iteration. That because this is online, a lot of this is viewable in many of the ways that Dr. Carley was talking about. There's a lot of trial and error that's possible from afar by adversarial agents that want to manipulate in very specific ways conversations. And so they can throw a lot of things at the wall. And there's not one wall, there's many walls, and they can learn what sticks where by watching and evolve and tune those things. And this is sort of a human machine learning spread. So if you read about how these sort of cyborg and bot farms, right, working, it's really throwing a lot out of things, it's learning and it's iterating and figuring out like what works in a situation over and over again. And those three things together, I think are distinct and difficult.
Well, and I think one of the things that really came through as you were describing these is, if we think about the targeting, the speed, the volume, the low cost of experimentation and development that you're saying, and deployment. I mean, it's dirt cheap to engage in one of these campaigns. I think one of the things that sometimes is difficult, I certainly find this in my own work, is in every case, we can look and say, well, sure, it was just a little bit more than it used to be. But there's a point at which, if you're, I don't know, I like to bake. And if you're baking, and you put cookies in the oven at 355 instead of 350, it's no problem. But if you put them in at 600 rather than 350, you've got a big problem. And I think sometimes what we're encountering, it seems in many ways, with the current spread of mis and disinformation is we've sort of been gradually increasing, and then we look up and realize we're at 600 degrees and things have gone horribly wrong. And I think that's something that is important to think about when we think about responses. I mean, I know you and I were planning to talk about that a little bit more, and certainly at the end of this symposium, coming back to the, well, what do we do question. But I think it's important sometimes for us all to remember that there wasn't one moment in time when suddenly this got bad. It's always been present, but manageable, and has gradually gotten worse and worse at an accelerating speed. I mean, I think if you just look at the ways technologies are changing, it's accelerating so rapidly.
I think that's exactly right. That's a great way of putting it, particularly, shifting the window from pre, right, to after, or, yesterday, material to digital, that there's been a shift. So a lot of people will focus on cable news, right, as being one of these transitional pieces that helps tell the story. From pre to post. And I think that's like absolutely important. I would say one of the things that we've learned related to that, I like your kitchen, like baking metaphor, is that in one of the ways we kind of think that the marketplace of ideas, right, should be two people in a bake-off, right? And then the better baked goods win. And I think one of the things we've learned through this acceleration is that, you know, some people just win by ruining everything. And so this idea, like, especially from the outside, trolling, that disruption actually, I think, is the place where we really need to focus on the difference between just normal debate to honest people with a disagreement trying to come up with what's best, right? Versus understanding campaigns that are really about blocking social learning and blocking useful policies, whatever they are, with potentially incoherent strategies. But how do you figure that out? Like, how do you separate that from the honest debate is, I think, the $1 million question. So it's like trying to bake, you know, in some sense, when someone's plopped a toddler down, right? And said, like, you know, do these things at the same time.
Yeah, no, and I think, you know, what that also highlights is the sort of feedback loops, which is the disinformation isn't happening in isolation. It's happening in a broader context, and in particular in a broader political context. And obviously political sensitivities are quite heightened right now and will be for coming weeks. But I think, you know, when I look at, as a not political scientist, but an informed and engaged citizen, you know, when I look at the ways that polarization has been inflamed and informed by disinformation, but then it works in the other way as well, that polarization creates climates where disinformation is more receptive. There's more focus on a sort of demonization of the other when you're in a more polarized environment. So you're more willing to believe things that seem, at least on their face, to perhaps be ludicrous. I mean, nobody would possibly think that, but if you almost dehumanize the other side in a political debate, which is part of what happens in polarization, then it becomes that much easier. And am I going too far when I say that? I mean, you know, is that a factor in all of this? Is that this isn't just taking place in the cyber world. This is having real world consequences, which then feed back, that we really have a multi-layered system here, not just one injection of an attack, as it were.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, one of the challenges, the reason for a center like this that we're, you know, participating in launching, a forum like this, is just the multiple layers, the complexity of the system in which information flows. It's vastly complex. It's incredibly important. It's online and it's offline. And I don't have all the answers, right, to that, but I do know like there are individual level things, right? There are group level processes. There are flows between those. There's governance of society, and there's international, you know, consequences. All of those are interacting in this system. And we as humans, we're sort of conditional probability machines. We're most comfortable when we can say, oh, here's my assumptions, and then let's reason like from those set of assumptions conditionally. And in a system level, like the way this is happening, the flows, the movement, it's much more complicated than that. It's much harder to get a handle on. So I don't think you're wrong at all about those things. And I would say, like, one of the things we've tried to do because of the complexity is we've built sort of open source tools for simulations of disinformation and misinformation flows. Basically create agent-based models where experts are just trying to honestly communicate with people that may or may not believe different informations, and watch how different platform rules affect the ability to solve problems, adversarial strategies, and other things. And what you learn in watching this is that disinformation, and particularly disruptive information that's trying to push people away from certain useful policies, sort of disrupt baking the great cake, but you don't really care what happens. You care, like, you just want entropy. You don't necessarily, you just want to keep them away from some useful point and agreement, is how heterogeneity across groups can be exploited from the outside. So there's great works by like Scott Page on the power of diversity. And the power of diversity, right, in some sense comes from different groups and people knowing different parts of reality, because we're all limited, and being able to share that. And that's the beauty and the benefit of the marketplace of ideas. But that can be disrupted when you have polarization. I prefer the term sorting like for this, because polarization sort of, there's a geometry that I don't think we have yet, right, to polarization of what it is. Where like work by Kornschmidt and others about like people have been sorting, right, into like groups across different dimensions of their lives more and more. And then you know people that are like you, and you don't know people that are unlike you. And what that does, particularly when we have data valence, is it's easier to spot you. I don't have to know exactly who you are. I just need to know what kind of group you belong to. If you become more like that group, I can target messages to that group to move them in one direction, or even just keep them where they are if they don't know to wear a mask, right? Or the useful information. I can do that for these other groups too. And if these groups aren't talking to each other and not sharing the incoherence of these signals, the common ground, right, that's there, things get caricatured, and absolutely we get the pushing apart, I think, that we see. And so we see this in the model. Like, we see drifting apart, like, of these groups together. And, you know, sort of, you can think about, like, disinformation isn't just the messages, it's the beliefs. It's like the visions and perspectives of the world that are getting pushed apart, which everything is conditioned on later too. So I don't think you're overstating it.
Emphasizing that element of diversity, I think, is absolutely crucial about the feedback loops. I mean, as you said, there's just this enormous now research literature showing that diversity, in the sense of many sources of information, many perspectives, many backgrounds, contribute to improved outcomes in a wide range of problems and domains. And yet a lot of things about the internet are leading to a reduction in the diversity of views, perspectives, information we get access to. Even a little bit of noise can sometimes make things a little bit better by virtue of breaking people out of their habits or their views. I'm reminded of the now old joke about the internet, that everything you can say about the internet, you can say in a happy tone or a sad tone. You know, the internet will help everyone find people like them. The internet will help people find people like them. And it seems we're seeing that play out in the political space, and it's just being accelerated with the use of disinformation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. Like, we know vegetables are good for us, but that doesn't mean we eat enough of them. And in the same way, we know finding diverse information is important. But I think this is where, like, platforms, I think, have some responsibility. The algorithms that are serving us, they're actually, serving us to advertisers, but right, that are showing us, information in a particular way. Those have consequences for, like, how we process, what we prioritize, what the social proof is around us. That help justify pre-existing conditions and others. And it can be hard, right? There can be sort of walking downhill or uphill, right, to get those things. And I think far too often we're walking uphill to the vegetable patch of information.
Yeah, no, and not wanting to drag us down a rabbit hole, to keep the gardening metaphor going, I think there's all kinds of interesting questions that then arise about not just the legal obligations or possibilities for the companies, but also their ethical and social obligations. Do they have an ethical obligation to try and produce a better information environment, or do their obligations end with the legal of make sure that they're not illegally suppressing speech? Mm-hmm. But so now, I mean, I can't help but ask a question that I suspect is on many people's minds. They often are when I talk to people about these kinds of issues, which is basically well, isn't this all just hopeless worry? I mean, aren't we at a point now where things have gotten so bad that, is there really anything we can do? I mean, when you start to talk about, we have to have systemic thinking, and we have to have multi-layer models, and we have to be able to engage in actual policy and praxis. At what point do we say, this has just gotten too bad, and oh well? I mean, that's not a satisfying response, but is there any hope? I mean, what can we do?
So I think there is reason for hope across these different levels. And Dr. Carley already, I think, hinted and explicitly laid out some of them that I think it's important to reiterate. First, a lot of this is our personal choice of what information we consume, where do we look. How often do we have conversations with people about their information sources and what they do to reinforce good habits? In some ways, we've been able to take for granted what I call informational sovereignty. That information, right, that we fed, maybe it was, over time, lower heterogeneity, right? But we sort of, at least some people believed, or enough people believed it, to act on it, to have policies that had some coherence moving forward. We need to get back to some of that. And there are individual level choices that we all can make to do better, like in these regards. And so, it is fact checking, but it's about the vegetables. It's about when someone serves you something that looks like it's like, wow, I want this to be true so badly. You need to triple check that, because you should know that people know what people like you want to see, and they can be serving you that. And it might be, the way things are set up, they might not mean to. That message was passed to you algorithmically because the person didn't know it, but the algorithm learned that this is something that you would spend more time on as you scrolled through. So I think the individual level, being careful, like thinking about your information ecosystem like a diet, I think it's very, very important. At the group level, I think it's absolutely crucial that we find cross-cutting cleavages that can be uncomfortable, that we get out of. The evidence on like echo chambers and filter bubbles, like lots of people are getting messages from different sources, but a lot of those are sarcastic. A lot of those are making fun of, right, the other side. And, you know, this return to empathy that is talked about a lot in the humanities, I think absolutely has a place in our social science discussion of what to do and how to bring people closer together. And one sort of model of governance and information that might be useful here is, you know, a decade ago or, you know, 5 years ago, if you had told me like Wikipedia was going to be a place where I was okay students going for information, I would have said you're crazy. But there is something to the platform of social editing, of people working out disagreements in text in a common platform with a common goal that is more resilient in our research than solo authored social media platforms where you just pass a message, right, anonymously and on, right, and that affects beliefs that flow. And so I think there are choices to make for platforms and the way we organize what is the collaborative enterprise of democracy and governance across the world to do this better. There's probably a role for regulation when there are externalities, you know, to technologies. There is a role for regulation in that. The problem is it's the, you know, the snake that eats its own tail. How do you agree if you can't agree on what the problems are, or the solution, or who's, you know, who's in charge of it? You know, how do you solve that? And we're pretty far from that, I think, in this country. You know, others, the EU has tried, you know, some innovative strategies. And I think it's important, like, just to underline all these things, we can learn from what other countries are doing on this too. So disinformation and misinformation is not a US specific malady, even if we feel it around the election and other things very acutely. And, you know, so learning in the policy laboratory of other democracies about what's working and not, and innovating in this area is crucial.
You know, I just want to pick up on a few things you said. I mean, first, I think you're right to emphasize that, you know, we need to make sure we aren't, as it were, letting people off the hook too easily as individuals. I think in some ways, a lot of what's happening with disinformation looks a lot like the classic tragedy of the commons, where everybody brings their sheep to graze on the town commons and it ends up just being completely brown and decimated. No one individual can do anything, in the sense that if I don't bring my sheep, it doesn't matter. Everyone else is, so the grass is going to be destroyed anyway. Nonetheless, if we all do our part, we can save the commons. And so in general, when we think about disinformation, you know, if I do my little piece, that isn't going to ultimately change things by me alone. But we can't then allow that to turn into a kind of defeatism of, oh, so therefore I have no, you know, social, community, ethical obligation to try and do my part. And you know, as you said, there's a lot of things that we as individuals can do. I thought it was very interesting that during Kathleen's talk, one of the attendees posted a question that was basically said, you know, you said a lot of things at the start were claims that were false. Do you have any links that you can give so I could follow up on that? Because, you know, just because we're saying these things also doesn't necessarily mean that people should take it without any sort of criticism or reflection. I mean, we do need to, I think, ensure that we don't go down the path of the destruction of expertise, to say that everybody is an expert and so therefore no one is. There are people who have different levels of knowledge, different levels of time thinking about and reflecting on these issues, and we should acknowledge that when we're trying to get information about our world. Nonetheless, I think it's not a bad thing to say to people, you know, show your work. It's okay to ask for that, and to you know, sort of build off of a question that I saw pop up from an attendee, John Greffenstedt, saying, you know, do we need to teach critical thinking and skepticism earlier? And as the father of a teenager, there's a kind of inherent skepticism that they have at that age. But I also think it is really important. I mean, I will tell a story on my daughter that, you know, I remember when she was in middle school, having to sit down and explain to her that anyone can put a web page up. Just because you find something on the web does not mean that there is anything good that's backing it. You know, I could put one up that says, I'm king of the world. I can do that. It doesn't make it true. And, you know, starting to teach even at a very young age, you know, she was fortunate, I suppose, to have me around to explain these things to her. But how do we start moving that? I think is a really important question that gets to how we build a kind of community resilience. That's a word you use that I think is really valuable here, because disinformation has always been here, it always will be, but how do we make communities more resilient to that?
Yeah.
So that they aren't being distorted in problematic ways.
And just the flip side of that, I really want to say that I think experts have a role to play here too, as individuals, in sharing more of the messiness. I think part of the problem is this idea that there's sort of false certainty, that we know the answer, like this is absolutely right. Truth is a moving target. Useful policies, we're discovering new things like all the time. And so sharing that distribution of information, both the good and the bad, and trusting the public to be able to handle the good and the bad and more of the whole truth. And the messy bits, I think, is absolutely crucial. And I do think we're in this sort of middle ground where there's an expectation of certainty, at least on one side or the other, that we can and need to move beyond.
Yeah, and especially as we think about, I've seen several people asking about, but what about, people's, in many countries, quite justified distrust of official sources. Mm-hmm. And, what do you do? Well, what would you and I do when we run into these? You have to actually do some of the work. And I think showing people, here's how I came to have these beliefs. Here's how we came to decide that this is a bot. I think there's a completely different direction for this, but there's actually interesting technological questions about, as Kathleen said, you probably can't detect most bots now, but there is software that can do it. Well, can the software explain why? And the importance of these kinds of things as we think about building trusted sources, or at least trusted for certain kinds of information.
Yeah. Do we still have time? I
think we still have a few more minutes. Darlene isn't shooing us off the stage quite yet.
We do, and we have a number of questions from the chat, which, David, you are welcome. I noticed that you've already incorporated a couple of those, so I'll stay on the line in case I can help facilitate those, but by all means, proceed.
Do you have a question you want? I wanted to follow up on one thing you said related to that. So I think this idea of coordination and collaboration, like going back to the commons ideas, is crucial. And we also need to think about how do we put the sensors, the critical thinking skills, but also the technological markers down that we can identify authentic actors, from those that are inauthentic in doing this. And that's one of the things I think that really we've failed at in the popular platforms right now, how easy it is to have anonymity and multiple accounts and bots and cyborgs and other things that really could help, I think, moving forward, even if it's not your name necessarily, but being able to identify incoherent messages, right, from a source used to be pretty easy. And if you look back at like sort of deliberation, I mean, that was one of the key tells for everyone, about whether we were contributing to a common good of this deliberation or not. And it's very difficult to do that now. And that's again, a systems level perspective on it.
It is. I suppose I want to push back a little though and say, the part of the challenge is there's times anonymity is absolutely critical. If you are an investigative journalist in Brazil, or heck, in parts of the United States, it's absolutely crucial that you have access to anonymous information dissemination channels, that you have ways of getting things out so that you are not putting yourself at even more quite literally physical harm, a risk of death in some cases. So, it's the on the internet, anybody can be anonymous, can be a good or a bad thing, and trying to think through what are the times it's okay. I mean, we saw this happening with newspapers 5 years ago when suddenly a bunch of newspapers realized they had to start explaining why they were granting anonymity to their sources, because sometimes it's okay, but other times, why do you need to be anonymous? And so, these get into judgment calls quickly, and then we're into the world of, well, who makes those judgment calls?
That's all true, and it gets to be a hall of mirrors very quick. But I don't know. Tell me, maybe there's a better word for this, right? So one of the most important things in like congressional investigations of intelligence is the ability, right, you don't give people's names in the report, but you give them identifiers, right? So you can track the narrative across. And that's more what I'm talking about. So it's not being able to put a name and a social security number, right, like to a piece of information. It's to connect information to a source, even if that source is anonymous, to be able to compare the coherence of the arguments for authenticity and inauthenticity moving forward. So I don't have the term for it, but that's what I mean.
I think that goes back. I mean, I think an interesting example is to think about it. Well, not example, but is to sort of think about it through the lens of trust. You can have a trusted anonymous source, but why are they trusted? They're trusted because of the history, because you have some understanding of the messages they're conveying, of the information to which they have access. Much longer story, and I know we're going to be hearing a lot more about communities of trust and notions of trust from Brian later. So I think that's there's very interesting ways to think about, could we have something in between? Right now we have an internet where anyone can be anonymous for any reason. We also have reason to think we don't want to be in a world where everybody has to be completely identifiable for every reason. What's the middle ground? Is it pseudonymity? Is it de-identification, to build off of some of the comments that are appearing? How do you have the ability to have a history and gain a reputation, but without then being, as we know from healthcare data and other data, just because it looks de-identified doesn't mean it stays de-identified. So there is that trade-off. But we are starting to get a bit of a look from Darlene. So
Yes.
I think,
Can I give you one question from our chat thread to answer, and then we'll take the scheduled break that we have built into our program. So one of our attendees says, a few months ago, the UN launched a Verified initiative with the goal to tackle disinformation about COVID-19 by flooding digital space with facts. What else can international institutions and global NGOs do to combat disinformation that tends to be borderless rather than bordered like governments?
So I think that's a great point to have the international dimension here. And one of the findings from the scientific communication literature is just putting facts out there isn't enough. That you have to think about how to be persuasive. That we need to use some of the lessons of data valence about what are the things that will get people to believe you and have credibility. I mean, some of it's just about like experts being presentable as people. Some of it's about international organizations admitting their faults and showing some warts and being credible in the information that they're providing. All of this is crucial and important, but we're learning, I think, how to do it on the fly, particularly in this age of sorted information. And when you talk about sorting, right, it gets even worse when you're talking about international politics and nationalities. So this is a very, it's hard, it's tricky. I would say everyone should go check out like Cranky Uncle, which is a wonderful app and website by Dr. Cook, who's an attempt to like talk about scientific communication and disinformation, particularly on climate change, but also in other areas too.
And I just would quickly note, because I know we're going to come back to some of this in the panel at the end when we talk about sort of responses, but I think one of the great things about the UN effort is it shows that I think can be this tendency to say disinformation is bad, therefore we should get rid of it. But as Kathleen pointed out, just trying to block all of it doesn't work. What you need counter narratives. You need to show people how their experience is explained in the right way, not through the false narratives. And I think that's one of the things that's really powerful about the UN effort is that they're not saying let's restrict it. They're in very smart ways trying to give good speech to counter.
Dr. David Danks and Dr. Michael Colorisi, I want to thank you so much for this really lively and informative conversation. It was a pleasure to listen in, and I look forward to hearing more from both of you in our concluding segment of the program.